I always thought I had more time. Henry sat alone in a dimly lit diner, staring at the rain streaking down the window. His fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The hum of the radio mixed with the clatter of silverware, but the silence in his own mind was deafening. Outside, life moved on. Headlights blurred past, people hurried through the downpour, umbrellas tilted against the wind. The world never stopped. But for Henry, tonight, everything felt still. Maybe it was the ache in his joints that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the empty seat across from him. Or maybe it was the invitation folded in his pocket. Class of 1974, 50-year high school reunion. He had almost thrown it away when it arrived last week. What was the point? Half the names on that list were just memories now, and the other half, what would they even say to him? Hey, Henry, what have you been up to? Nothing much. Just spent half a century avoiding the one thing I was meant to do. Just let time slip through my fingers, convincing myself there'd always be another chance. He took a sip of the coffee and winced. Bitter. Stale. He set it down and let his gaze drift to the rain-slick streets outside. His own reflection stared back at him, lined and weathered, a man he barely recognized. Once, Henry Parker had a dream. Once, he had been someone. You were born for this, kid. That's what his music teacher had told him after his first recital. Henry could still remember the way his fingers moved effortlessly over the keys, the way the music swelled inside him, the way it had felt like he was touching something bigger than himself. It was the only time in his life he had felt truly alive. For years, music had been his escape, his purpose, the thing that made the world make sense. And then reality came knocking. Music doesn't pay the bills, Henry. You need a real job. His father's words, sharp and dismissive. His mother had been gentler. We just want you to have a secure future, sweetheart. So he did what they wanted. He put away his sheet music. He stopped practicing. He let the dream die. One job turned into another. Days blurred into years. And every time he passed a piano in a department store or saw a street performer with a keyboard, something inside him twisted. But he always told himself there'd be time. One day, I'll play again. One day, I'll get back to it. One day, when things settle down. But one day never came. The bell above the diner door jingled. Henry barely looked up until a voice cut through the low hum of the room. Henry Parker? The sound of his own name sent a jolt through his chest. He turned and froze. David Whitmore. His old best friend. His old bandmate. The only person who had ever believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. David slid into the seat across from him like no time had passed. He was older now, of course, thinner, grayer, but the smile was the same. Warm. Knowing. You got the invitation, huh? David nodded at the envelope on the table. Henry hesitated. Thought about ignoring it. David chuckled. Figured you would. He studied Henry for a moment, his expression softening. You know, we all thought you'd make it, Henry. Out of all of us, you had the real talent. Henry looked away. Life got in the way, he muttered. David leaned forward. Or maybe you let it. The words hit harder than Henry wanted to admit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain drummed against the glass. Somewhere in the back, the waitress refilled someone's coffee. David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. Come to the reunion, Henry. And come to the showcase. Henry frowned. Showcase. Yeah, we're putting on a little concert. Just like the old days. Some of the guys are getting together, playing for old times' sake. You should play too. Henry's stomach dropped. I haven't touched a piano in decades. So what? David shrugged. It's never too late, Henry. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Henry stared at the paper in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, unfolding it. He had spent his whole life thinking he had more time. What if this was his last chance? Henry sat in his apartment long after midnight, the folded paper from David resting on the coffee table like a quiet challenge. The dim glow from the kitchen light cast long shadows over the cluttered space. He had lived here for over 20 years, but suddenly, the walls felt smaller, the silence heavier. The idea of playing again unsettled him in a way he didn't fully understand. He had spent so long convincing himself that the dream didn't matter, that he had let it go. But now, after one conversation, after one simple invitation, the past was clawing its way back. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and rubbed his hands together. His fingers, the same fingers that once danced over piano keys with ease, with confidence. Could they still move the way they used to? Did they still remember? Or had time stolen that from him too? The thought made his chest tighten. He should just ignore the invitation, Let the reunion pass like every other meaningless event in his life. No one expected anything from him anymore. No one would care if he didn't show up. But David cared. David, who had looked at him like he still saw the 18-year-old Henry, the one who had once believed in something. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He needed air. Henry grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cold night air bit at his skin as he walked aimlessly through the empty streets. He wasn't sure where he was going until he found himself in front of the old music store on the corner of Franklin and 8th. The store had been there for as long as he could remember, though the name had changed over the years. Through the dark glass, he could just make out the rows of instruments inside. And in the center, like a ghost from his past, a grand piano sat under the fluorescent lights. His fingers twitched at the sight of it. He should keep walking. But before he could think, before he could stop himself, he was pushing open the door. The bell above jingled, and the man behind the counter looked up, surprised to see a customer at this hour. "We're closing soon," the man said, wiping his hands on a rag. Henry hesitated. I haven't played in a long time." His eyes flickered toward the piano. "Would it be all right if I—" The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Go ahead." Henry approached the piano slowly, as if afraid it might disappear if he got too close. His heart pounded as he pulled out the bench and lowered himself onto it. He let his hands hover over the keys, his breath unsteady. It had been so long. He pressed down on a single note. The sound rang out, crisp and clear. His fingers moved hesitantly to the next, then the next, forming a simple melody, one he used to play in his sleep. But it was shaky, uneven, like trying to speak a language he hadn't used in years. His left hand faltered. His right followed. The notes clashed, wrong, foreign. Frustration burned in his chest. His hands clenched into fists, hovering over the keys. This was a mistake. He wasn't that person anymore. He started to push away from the bench, but a voice stopped him. "Keep going." Henry turned. The man behind the counter had stepped closer, watching him intently. Henry shook his head. "I can't. I'm not." The man crossed his arms. "You came in here for a reason. No one walks in at this hour just to look." Henry swallowed hard. He looked back at the keys. His reflection stared at him from the glossy black surface. An old man trying to reach for something long gone. But he wasn't gone yet. He took a breath. Let his hands relax. He started again, slower this time. He let the music come, uneven at first, but then something shifted. The melody found its rhythm, his fingers finding their way like tracing the outline of an old memory. The sound filled the room. Not perfect, not effortless like it once was, but real. When he finished, the silence that followed was thick, almost sacred. The man behind the counter nodded. "Looks like you've still got something left in you." Henry stared down at his hands. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a man who had run out of time. But feeling it wasn't enough. The next morning, Henry sat at his kitchen table, staring at his reflection in the small mirror by the counter. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. The hair, thinner and streaked with gray. The lines around his mouth, proof of a life that had passed too fast. He poured himself a cup of coffee and reached for the invitation again. 50 years. 50 years since he had been that kid, the one everyone thought would make it. He had spent so much time avoiding the past, burying it, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. It always had. The memory of last night lingered, the feel of the keys under his fingertips, the sound of music filling the empty store. It had been clumsy, but it had been there. Maybe David was right. Maybe he still had something left in him. But the thought of showing up at the reunion, of stepping into that hall and seeing faces that once knew him as someone full of promise, it made his stomach turn. He set the invitation down and reached for the remote. The news droned in the background, voices blending together as he tried to drown out his thoughts. Then the phone rang. Henry hesitated before answering. "Hello. Henry, it's David." His voice was calm, steady. "You think about what I said?" Henry ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't know, Dave. I don't think I can." "You can." The certainty in David's voice made something tighten in Henry's throat. "We're not kids anymore," Henry muttered. "People don't just pick up where they left off. It doesn't work like that." David sighed on the other end. "Look, I know it's scary. I know it's been a long time. But if you don't do this now, Henry, when will you?" Henry had no answer. David's voice softened. "We've all got regrets. but we can't let them define us. You think I don't wonder what would have happened if we'd stuck together? If we'd fought harder for it? He paused. But this isn't about the past anymore. It's about what you do now. Henry swallowed, his grip on the phone tightening. We have one rehearsal before the reunion, David continued. Come. Just come. If you hate it, you can walk away. But at least you'll know. Henry closed his eyes. He had spent his whole life thinking he had more time. But what if this was his last chance? Henry arrived at the rehearsal space 15 minutes early, but he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, debating whether to leave. The building was smaller than he expected, an old community hall with faded brick and a narrow set of double doors. Through the windshield, he could see a few people milling around inside, adjusting chairs, setting up stands. It felt too real now, too exposed. It was one thing to play alone in a quiet music store at night. It was another to step into a room full of people who had once expected great things from him. He reached for the keys to turn the ignition, but then he saw David stepping outside. Henry cursed under his breath. Too late to leave now. David caught sight of him and waved, his expression unreadable. Henry forced himself to get out of the car. You actually showed up, David said, amused. Don't make a big deal out of it. David smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. Come on. Inside, the room smelled of dust and old wood. Folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle, a few occupied by faces Henry vaguely recognized. Some of them glanced up as he entered. Others were too busy tuning their instruments to notice. A few had aged so much that Henry wouldn't have known them if David hadn't pointed them out earlier. And then there was the piano. It was nothing special, just an upright, slightly battered with a few scuff marks along the edges, but it made Henry's stomach tighten. It had been years since he had played with others, years since he had to keep time with anyone but himself. David clapped a hand on his back. You all right? No, Henry muttered. David chuckled. You'll be fine. Come on, let's get started. The others slowly settled into place. A woman with silver hair adjusted her violin under her chin. A man with a trumpet tapped his foot as he flipped through sheet music. Someone else, Henry didn't catch their name, was unpacking a saxophone. David picked up his guitar and strummed a few chords, clearing his throat. All right, before we start, introductions for those who've been off the grid for a few decades. He glanced at Henry. A few chuckles. Henry stiffened. David continued. Henry here was our prodigy back in the day. If you heard us play at a school assembly, he was the reason we sounded halfway decent. Henry let out a sharp exhale. That was a long time ago. Yeah, David waved a hand. Now let's see if you still have some of that magic. The sheet music was placed in front of him. A simple arrangement, nothing too complex. But as Henry's eyes scanned the notes, his vision blurred. The symbols felt foreign, like a language he had once spoken fluently but had since forgotten. The others started playing, their instruments blending into a familiar, rhythmic pulse. David's guitar kept steady time, the violinist carried the melody. Henry hesitated before placing his fingers on the keys. Then he pressed down. The sound was jarring, hesitant, uneven. He winced. His hands felt clumsy, disconnected from his brain. He knew what the notes were supposed to be, but his fingers lagged behind, fumbling through sections that had once been second nature. The others barely reacted, too focused on their own parts, but Henry felt it like a weight pressing down on his chest. He wasn't keeping up. He was dragging the whole thing down. David shot him a look, encouraging, not pitying, but it didn't help. Halfway through, Henry pulled his hands away from the keys. Sorry, he muttered. The music trailed off as David set his guitar down. What's wrong? I can't do this. Henry stood up too fast, nearly knocking over the bench. He could feel his face burning. I told you this was a mistake. David's expression darkened. Henry. But Henry was already moving, heading for the door. The others exchanged awkward glances, but no one stopped him. Outside, the cool evening air hit him like a slap. He braced himself against the side of his car, gripping the metal so hard his knuckles turned white. What was he thinking? That he could just walk in here after 50 years and play like nothing had changed? That they would all just accept him back, as if he hadn't spent a lifetime running in the opposite direction? His breathing was unsteady. His chest felt tight. He had been right to leave music behind. He was too old to start again. The door creaked open behind him. You want to tell me what that was? David's voice was calm, but there was something firm underneath it. Henry let out a hollow laugh. What do you think? I don't belong in there. David stepped closer. You think any of us do? Henry didn't answer. We're all past our prime, David continued. None of us play like we used to. Hell, Half of them haven't touched their instruments in decades. You think that violinist in there picked up her bow yesterday and played like that? No. She struggled. Just like you are. Henry clenched his jaw. That's different. Is it? Silence stretched between them. David sighed. Listen, I didn't ask you to come here so you could prove you're still some prodigy. I asked you to come because you loved this once. Because it meant something to you. And because I think it still does. Henry swallowed hard, staring at the pavement. David stepped in front of him. You're scared. I get it. But you don't get to quit before you even try. Henry let out a shaky breath. A few minutes passed. David didn't push him to speak. Just waited. Finally, Henry ran a hand down his face. I don't even know if I can do this anymore. David nodded slowly. Maybe not. But you won't know unless you walk back in there. Henry hesitated, glancing toward the door. David smiled. You've got nothing to lose, Henry. Except time. Henry let that sink in. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside. Henry stepped back into the rehearsal room, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. The others had resumed playing, though their eyes flickered toward him with cautious curiosity. He ignored them and made his way to the piano, his legs feeling heavier with each step. David followed, but he didn't say anything, didn't push, just sat back down, picked up his guitar, and continued strumming along with the rest of the group as if Henry had never left. The bench creaked as he lowered himself onto it again. The sheet music was still in front of him, the notes staring back like a challenge. He flexed his fingers, trying to shake off the stiffness, then pressed them lightly against the keys. His hands were trembling. David gave him a glance, his voice casual. Whenever you're ready. Henry exhaled and played the first chord. It was shaky, uneven, but this time, he didn't stop. He moved into the next measure, forcing himself to keep going even when his fingers hesitated, even when his mind screamed that it wasn't good enough. The others followed without hesitation, their instruments filling the space around him, carrying the melody forward. At first, he was drowning in the sound, disjointed, always a second too slow, but then something shifted. His muscles loosened. The tension in his chest eased. His hands started to remember. It wasn't perfect. The rhythm wasn't as steady as it should have been, his touch wasn't as precise. But the longer he played, the more it felt like the weight he had been carrying for decades was lifting, note by note. The song ended, and for the first time in years, Henry felt something other than regret when he lifted his hands from the keys. He let out a breath, rubbing his palms against his thighs. His shirt was damp with sweat. David grinned. Not bad for an old man. Henry huffed out a laugh. You sound worse than I do. A few chuckles rippled through the group, and just like that, the tension in the room faded. The violinist, Margaret, he finally remembered, gave him an approving nod before adjusting her sheet music. The others settled in, ready for the next song. No one said anything more about his stumbling or hesitation. They just kept playing. And so did he. For the next hour, they moved through piece after piece, their rhythm tightening with each attempt. Henry still wasn't as fluid as he once was, but he was learning to keep up. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about playing, about feeling the music move through him again, about reconnecting with something he had convinced himself was lost forever. By the time they wrapped up for the night, Henry's hands ached, but he felt lighter than he had in years. As they packed up, the others chatted easily, some discussing work schedules, others reminiscing about old performances. Margaret approached, tucking her violin case under her arm. You did well tonight. Henry shook his head. I barely kept up. She smirked. Neither did the rest of us. Then she gave him a knowing look. You're coming back next week, right? Henry hesitated. He could feel David watching him from a few feet away, waiting for his answer. Finally, Henry exhaled. Yeah, I think I am. Margaret nodded in approval and headed toward the door. David clapped a hand on his shoulder. See? Not so bad. Henry let out a tired laugh. I haven't been this exhausted since my kids were toddlers. David grinned. Well, at least the piano won't wake you up at 3 in the morning demanding food. Henry shook his head, chuckling, then grabbed his coat. As he stepped outside, the night air felt different, crisper, clearer. He wasn't sure if anything had truly changed yet, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was running out of time. But then came the next rehearsal. He showed up, same as before, only this time the nervousness had dulled into something closer to hesitation rather than outright panic. He was still stiff, still struggling with sections that should have come naturally, But the frustration wasn't eating him alive like before. He stumbled, and instead of retreating into silence, he pushed through it. The others weren't perfect either, and something about seeing their missteps, their own imperfections, made it easier. Margaret flubbed a run in the second movement of a piece and muttered a quiet curse under her breath. David mistimed his entry on a new piece and laughed it off. Someone forgot a key change entirely, and the whole group fell apart in an awkward mess of sound before they started again. They weren't professionals. They were just people who loved to play. And slowly, over the next few weeks, Henry started to love it again too. At first, it was just a habit, showing up, playing, trying not to mess up too badly. But then, somewhere along the way, it became something more. He found himself practicing at home, his fingers moving over the keys long after he should have gone to bed. He found himself looking forward to rehearsal, counting down the days instead of dreading them. One night, after a particularly strong session, David slung his guitar strap over his shoulder and nodded toward him. "You're getting better." Henry scoffed. "It's been weeks. If I wasn't, I'd have bigger problems." David smirked. "You ever think about playing outside of here?" Henry frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's a recital in a few months. Small thing. Just a community showcase, nothing fancy. But it might be nice to play in front of people again." Henry froze. David noticed. "Just think about it." Henry did think about it. He thought about it the whole way home, thought about it while he sat at his piano late that night, hands resting over the keys without pressing down. A performance. A real one. He hadn't played for an audience since he was a teenager. Since before everything fell apart. Could he do it? Did he want to? He sat there for a long time before finally pressing a key, letting the note ring out into the quiet. Henry sat at the piano, his hands hovering just above the keys, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. The recital was 2 weeks away. David had given him time to decide, never pushing, but Henry saw the expectation in his eyes every rehearsal, the silent question hanging in the air. Are you going to do it? At first, Henry had dismissed it entirely. Performing again? After all these years? The idea alone was absurd. He had spent decades convincing himself that part of his life was over, that he had run out of time. And yet, the thought lingered, worming its way into his mind at odd hours of the day, settling in the quiet spaces of his home. He caught himself replaying old memories, the feeling of being on stage, the anticipation, the nerves, the way the music used to flow effortlessly through his fingers. It had been terrifying. It had been exhilarating. It had been his. The doubt crept in just as quickly. He was nowhere near the musician he once was. He struggled through rehearsals, still hesitated in places where he shouldn't. What if he made a fool of himself? What if this only confirmed what he had feared all along, that he had waited too long, that the chance had passed him by? One night, he found himself sitting at his kitchen table long after he had finished eating, staring at the untouched coffee in front of him. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. There had been a time when it wasn't so quiet, when the sound of tiny feet had echoed down the hallway, when laughter had filled the rooms, when music had spilled from the piano in the evenings. He had always meant to return to it, to play for his children, to share that part of himself with them. But life had gotten in the way, and then time had gotten away from him. He glanced toward the piano in the next room. The lid was still open, the sheet music from rehearsal sitting on the stand. He had spent so many years avoiding it, resenting it, missing it. Maybe this was his chance to finally face it. The next rehearsal, Henry arrived early. David was already there, tuning his guitar, but he paused when he saw Henry walk in. "You're early," David said, raising an eyebrow. Henry set his bag down by the piano. "I'm playing." David frowned. "Yeah, I figured. You've been showing up for weeks now." Henry exhaled, then met his friend's gaze. "At the recital." "I'm playing at the recital." For a moment, David just stared at him. Then, a slow grin spread across his face. About time. The weeks leading up to the recital passed in a blur of rehearsals and late-night practice sessions. Henry pushed himself harder than he had in years, determined to prove, to himself, more than anyone, that he could do this. There were moments of frustration, when his fingers didn't move as quickly as they should, when his memory betrayed him, when he doubted whether he was really ready. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't let the doubts win. The night of the recital arrived faster than he expected. The small venue was already filling with people by the time he arrived, a steady hum of conversation filling the air. He felt the nerves creeping in, a familiar sensation from long ago, tightening in his chest. David clapped him on the back. "You good?" Henry forced a breath. I'll let you know when it's over. The performances before him passed in a haze. He barely registered the music, barely noticed the applause. His mind was focused entirely on the moment ahead, on the piano waiting for him under the bright stage lights. And then, too soon, his name was called. He walked onto the stage, blinking against the lights as he sat down at the piano. The murmurs in the audience quieted, leaving only the heavy silence of expectation. He placed his hands on the keys. His fingers were shaking. For a brief moment, the fear threatened to take over. But then he pressed down, and the first note rang out. The music started slowly, uncertainly, but he didn't stop. He let himself fall into the rhythm, let the muscle memory guide him, let the years of silence fall away one note at a time. As he played, something shifted. The nerves faded, the weight in his chest lifted, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't just playing. He was feeling the music again. When the last note faded, there was a beat of silence. Then applause. Henry exhaled, his hands still resting on the keys. He had thought he had more time. He had spent years believing that the window had closed, that his moment had passed. But sitting there, the echoes of the music still lingering in the air, he realized something. Time didn't wait, but he had made the most of what was left.